Welcome to the 2020 Linn County Virtual Fair 4-H FFA Sheep Show.
And our first class is in Division 502 Breeding Sheep, Commercial Blackface Ewe. Sorry. And the first entry is entry 439.
Yeah, I really like this ewe lamb from the pictures from the side. She's tall-shouldered, has some shape from the side, really maternal in her underline and feminine through her front end, and looks to have some power from behind. We can move on to the next one.
Oh, here's the video.
Oh, yep. Yeah, as we set this ewe lamb into motion, she's one that we really like how she handles herself in terms of her top line. We could see her just maybe a notch more flexible off that rear hock, but one that still stays really good in her skeleton on the move.
This is the next entry, number 612.
This ewe lamb is really broody looking, really powerful built. As we can see from the side, how much shape she has through her lower leg. And then we look at the rear view and front pictures. She's got a lot of width through the under portion of her skeleton. We really like those things about her. We can move to the next one. Yeah, this ewe lamb is maybe not cooperating the best on the move for this young man, but you know, as we talked earlier, a really stout, broody appearing, wide-made ewe. But maybe as we studied her going away from us, maybe just pushes out at her hock just ever so slightly. Maybe not quite as tall-fronted as we would prefer, but one that really wide-made and powerful. We can go to the next one.
Okay, this is entry 822.
This ewe lamb is one that we really appreciate the top shape. She's really wide right behind her shoulder. She's one that's opened up in her rib cage, appears to be big over that loin, has some shape out through that hip. She's just one that maybe we could just lengthen out from the side and maybe just relax her in her top line just a little bit. But one, when we study her, that front portion of her skeleton, the shape behind her shoulder, that shape through that rib cage is really good. Can go to the video. And as we can see in the video here, when we set this ewe lamb into motion, we kind of I saw it a little bit within the still pictures. Her top line just maybe not quite as smooth. We can see her, you know, wanting to get up underneath herself a little bit, duck those pins ever so slightly, but one that still maintains that width up top. We really like her coming at us. She's really wide chested and big forearmed. Still has a really good sweep to her rib cage. We can go to the next one.
Okay, this is entry 831.
This ewe lamb we really appreciate in terms of her build from the side. She's got that cool uphill look about her. She really wedges to the front portion of her skeleton. She progressively gets wider from front to rear. She's one that, like we mentioned, has that cool sweep to her rib cage, blends smooth into that shoulder. If we were going to get critical on this one, we'd just like to see her bigger in her overall pin set and just be a notch smoother in her shoulder, but one that we really love from the side and has that really trendy uphill look about her that's shallow chested. Again, kind of as we saw in our pictures there, this ewe lamb is really cool built from the side, has that shallow chest, long neck look to her, gives her a really neat eye appeal and show ring appeal. Again, we can kind of see it in the video to where we would just like to make her wider in her pin set, give her a little bit more power from behind, and just smooth up that shoulder blade ever so slightly.
Okay, entry 1062.
So this ewe lamb here is one we really appreciate in terms of how she's tall shouldered. She's one that is long and level down that top line. She's one is stout at the ground. We really appreciate those things about her. When we look at the rear view, she's got some shape out through that hip and through that lower leg. And I imagine just, you know, based on the still frame shot, she's probably pretty big over that loin and over that rack. You know, where I would like to change this one is she maybe just gets a notch straight through that front end. You can see she doesn't want to give up that neck quite as easily for the exhibitor here. So if we could just kind of readjust that front 1/3 of her skeleton to make her just a notch more relaxed and lift her up there just a touch. But one that is really smooth made, has some power when we start to study her top shape and butt shape, and you know, really stout at the ground. As as we view this ewe lamb in motion, um, similar to what we talked about in the still photos, is a ewe lamb that is really smooth made, balances up nice, has some shape down her top. She's one that we'd like to relax her in that front shoulder, give her a little more flexibility there. But the one thing that when we set her into motion and get a few different angles on her, she's maybe not quite as up and out in her pin set. And when she sets into motion, she kind of ducks her pins just ever so slightly, but still a ewe lamb with a ton of balance and eye appeal, smooth made, really good top shape and stout at the ground.
This is entry 1091.
So we've got this lamb here that is really shapely from the side. You see a lot of that lower leg butt shape this one has. She's one that when you look at her top shape, you really appreciate the shape behind that shoulder and the roundness of her rib cage. She's one though that just studying these pictures, we'd like to just make a notch longer from flank to flank, and as well at the ground, give her a little more stoutness at the ground, more foundation underneath of her, but one with a ton of shape from the side and right behind that shoulder and over her rack and through that rib cage. A lot of power and broodiness working through this ewe. Yeah, and this ewe lamb, as we set her into motion, she covers her tracks really well. She's one that stays good in her front end and top line. But when we start to study her lower skeleton, as she's coming and going from us, she wants to close up ever so slightly, just maybe hock in a little bit. And as we get to studying that hip shape of this ewe lamb, we just like to make her bigger in her pin set. She's got the shape down low through that twist and center portion of her leg. She's got a lot of shape there, but we'd like to see that hip just a notch bigger to match the shape down low. But one that really good on the move in terms of covering her tracks and staying flexible in her skeleton.
This is entry 1092.
This ewe lamb here is one that we really appreciate the stoutness of foundation she has. She's wide based. She's stout in her features. One thing we can really tell in these pictures, just the muscle shape she has, especially right behind that shoulder and her rack shape. She's got a ton of lower leg shape as well. She's one that that she'd be fun to see what she looks like in person and get your hands on this one to see the true muscle shape this one has working down the top side of her skeleton. But as we think about places where we'd like to change this one, we'd like to make her just a notch rounder ribbed. She's just a little bit flat in that fore rib, just to give her a little more broodier, robust appearance in her rib cage. This one here, as we set her into motion, again, we really like, um, the shape that she has. We can still see that within this video. She's one that, as we get her out into motion, really shows off her shallow chest, that she's got a kind of a neat eye appealing underline to her. Um, and, if we were to get critical on this one in motion, she does just get a notch shorter about that hip, which causes her to get up underneath herself. And her rear too, when we set her into motion. But I really appreciate that shallow chest, that youthful look about her, and you could still see the stoutness of her foundation and the shape, muscle shape working in on this ewe lamb.
This is entry 1,213.
This ewe lamb here, is awfully impressive when we look at her rear view pictures. You can see how shapely she is right behind her shoulder, has a ton of muscle shape working over that rack, appears to be wide loined, and you study that hip and butt shape, and she's got a ton of it. She's wide based. From the side, she has, she sets down square underneath herself. She looks like she's getting her lower angles of her skeleton. She's one that has some balance from the side that we appreciate. But with as much power as she has, you know, we start to get a little heavier fronted there. We'd just like to smooth her up in her front end ever so slightly, but one that still, I think, has enough balance from the side and is really powerfully made and broody in her appearance. I think is an awfully good example of a brood ewe, in terms of power and robustness. Yeah, as we set that one into motion, we kind of see similarly what we saw in the photos there. One that still has plenty of balance, but as we get critical on animals, we always have areas where we'd like to tweak and change and always try and improve and make better. She's one that we just like to make her cleaner through that front 1/3. She's got a little bit of a breastplate there, but one that, as we talked about, has a ton of power and dimension when we get in behind her, and still balances up pretty well from the side, and she still handles herself well on the move. She stays collected in that top line and skeleton.
So this was the last exhibitor for this class, so the next slide will be multiple videos. Okay, so these are all of the entries for this class.
Okay, as we review all these entries, tremendous job by each exhibitor for continuing to work through this summer and breaking their lambs and preparing these videos. I know we'd all prefer to be in person, but we're making the best of it, and still an exciting opportunity to exhibit your guys' projects throughout the summer. And thank you to Linn County Fair for the opportunity to continue to work with you guys, give you guys the opportunity to show off what you've been working on and planning through your 4-H and FFA career here. For me, within this commercial U division, um, my class winner is going to be entry 439. Um, for me, she's just kind of the ideal picture in terms of when we start to describe a commercial ewe lamb. She's, like we mentioned, tall shouldered, smooth made from the side. She's one that's stout featured, balanced and blends really well. And then when we looked at her rear view and pictures and the video in motion, she has plenty of shape and dimension working through this ewe. She's wide based, and we really appreciate those things about her. Like I mentioned earlier on one of the entries, not any lamb is perfect, so there's always something we can improve upon. And this one, as we mentioned in her video, we'd just like to give her a little bit more flexibility through that rear hock to make her more comfortable in the way she handles herself on the lead. And then in second within this class, it's going to be the 12-13 entry. Really, hit me hard when we saw this ewe lamb's rear view. She's really powerfully built, big top, really thick out through that hip and through that lower leg. She still balances up well from the side when we see her propped up. She's one that sits down on her feet and legs well. But where I got critical of her and I tend to lean is, where we need to smooth her up in that front 1/3, just extend her up just ever so slightly and just make her a notch smoother there. But one that has plenty of power, plenty of robustness, and maybe if you got your hands on them, you could definitely argue that maybe she deserves to be the class winner, just how much shape she has on her top side. But really appreciate that about her. As we move down into selecting our third place here, 1062 will be that entry in third there. I think she resembles very similarly our class winner just in terms of smoothness and the way this one blends. She's one that we talked about in class that appears to be round in her rib cage, big over that top side of her skeleton. But as we talked when we set this one into motion, had a couple concerns in terms of how she handles the flexibility of her shoulder and maybe just not quite as big and out in that pin set when we get her into motion. Then for me, next in class would be the 612 entry. We talked about how powerfully built this one is, wide constructed. She's one that has a ton of shape. But when we start to analyze this one from a skeletal build standpoint and set her into motion, she just concerns you a little bit in terms of the length and extension up through that front 1/3. We'd just like to extend her out just a little bit, give her more stride out through that front end, and then maybe just pushing out a little excess, pushing that hock out when we view her from behind, going away from you. And then for my next placing within this class, really appreciated the 8-31 ewe lamb. We talked about how this one has a neat rib cage in her. She's shallow chested, runs uphill. She's one that you probably get your hands on her, and you see that shape over a rack right behind her shoulder. She's one that we appreciated those things about her. Maybe not quite as long hipped and not quite as flexible in the way she handles her rear two on motion, but one that that rib design and that shallowness and long neck, I think should offer a lot for this exhibitor. And then next for me is going to be the 1091 entry. She's one that we talked about how much shape this one has through that lower leg. She's one that's robust in that rib cage. She's one that really appreciate those things about her. She's got that broody, productive look in her. But when we did set her into motion, she's one that we mentioned we'd like to see her bigger in that pin set and maybe just a notch wider underneath as she started to hawk in just ever so slightly for us. Then we're going to follow that one with 822. 822 is one we talked about that round rib cage. She's one that has that broody appearing look to her. But when we start to get critical on this one, we'd just like to stretch her out from flank to flank just a little bit and just relax her in that top line ever so slightly. And then we round out the class with 1092, again, one that we appreciated a ton of things about. We really appreciate that true natural shape this one has on her top side of her skeleton, the stoutness at the ground. Visually, she's probably the lightest one or maybe the most immature within this division. But we don't want to hold that against her, just, judging her the way she is today. We just like to make her bigger in that rib cage, more maternal in that rib design for being a commercial U class. So congratulations to all these exhibitors and great job this summer with these commercial ewe lambs.
Okay, our next class is commercial home-raised ewes. And this is entry 1088, and this is the only entry for this class.
This ewe lamb's really neat built from the side, has that uphill look about her. She's one that we really appreciate those things about her, the stoutness at the ground. She's one that we'd just like to maybe stretch out just a notch from flank to flank, maybe just in a couple of the pictures, just level her out ever so slightly in that hip, but one that runs uphill, stout featured, appears to have some dimension working down that top and out through that hip. So entry 439 will be blue ribbon. Entry 1213, blue ribbon. Entry 1062, blue ribbon. Entry 612, blue ribbon. Entry 831, blue ribbon. Entry 1091, blue ribbon. Entry 822, red ribbon. Entry 1092, red ribbon. A great job this summer with these commercial ewe lambs.
Okay, our next class is commercial home-raised ewes. And this is entry 1088, and this is the only entry for this class.
This ewe lamb's really neat built from the side, has that uphill look about her. She's one that we really appreciate those things about her, the stoutness at the ground. She's one that we'd just like to maybe stretch out just a notch from flank to flank, maybe just in a couple of the pictures, just level her out ever so slightly in that hip, but one that runs uphill, stout featured, appears to have some dimension, working down that top and out through that hip. As we can see here in the video, like we mentioned, it really gives us a neat picture. A ewe lamb that's good in her chest floor, good in that shoulder design, runs uphill. As we mentioned, we would just like to stretch her out a little bit in those couple areas, based on what we could see in the photos. We'd just like to make her a notch longer from flank to flank. Just like to level that hip out just ever so slightly, but one that this exhibitor should be very proud of in terms of being home raised and having that quality. Entry 1088 will be a blue ribbon.
Okay, so since I was the only exhibitor in that class, we're on to home raised market lambs.
We've got a wether here that's we really appreciate the length and extension this one has. One that when we start to study this one from the rear view, looks like has a nice big hip in him. He's one that we really appreciate those things about him. Appears to have some flexibility in those lower angles, and one that we really appreciate how smooth built how smooth he is in his build. But if we were to get critical on this one, when we start to study this one's top view, just directly behind his shoulder, we'd like to see more shape and squareness of that top right behind his shoulder. And then when we start to analyze his muscle from the side, we'd just like to give him a little bit more shape right through that lower leg, more outward curvature to that lower leg. Again, as we suspected within that video, this one handles himself well in his skeleton, well on his feet and legs, and we really appreciate that about him.
All right, the next entry is 609.
Well, this wether here appears to be, big topped. You look at the top shape in this one, has some shape over behind that shoulder and over that loin and out through that hip. We appreciate the round rib cage in this one. Where we do get critical on this one, just in terms of balance, we would just like to make this one a notch longer from the side. Let him relax in his front 1/3 or set him back in his shoulder angle, and give him more flexibility to that rear hock as well. So we'll see what this lamb looks like in the video. Yeah, and as we see here in the video, you know, those muscle indicators we saw on the photo, we definitely can see that here in the video and in that rib design. But again, that kind of the front 1/3 of his skeleton doesn't quite um, blend together quite as smooth with as much extension and length up through that front 1/3. Um, and we'd just like to change that area about him.
Okay, this is entry 1093.
A really neat designed lamb here, one that we really appreciate the underline in this one in terms of running uphill and being shallow chested. You start to kind of study the muscle shape in this one. He appears to have a lot of shape through that outer and lower leg, one that stays level in his top line. He looks stout at the ground. We really appreciate that about this one. You know, just initial impressions. We would like to make them just a notch rounder ribbed, but that's getting critical of a pretty darn good one. Really like how this one handles himself on his feet and legs, stays level in that top line, and it's correct in his angles of his lower joints. And as this young lady props this one up from the side, as we could see from the pictures, has that really neat uphill look about him and stout featured look.
These are the 3 entries from this class.
So as we, you know, compare and contrast these 3 entries, for me, the class winner, 1093, will be a blue ribbon entry. He's one that we talked about a ton of good things about, stout featured, um, really muscular in his shape, and then especially when we studied this one skeleton, runs uphill and shallow chested. So we really appreciated those things about him. Uh, then we're going to move on to uh, entry 388 as well, blue ribbon. Uh, like we mentioned in the individual photos and video, really long and extended, or whether that handles himself good on his feet and legs. We just need to make him bigger over that rack and rib and through that lower portion of his leg to be more competitive with our class winner today. And then as we round out the class with entry 609 will be a red ribbon, one that we talked about. We love the muscle shape and the width and dimension this one has. But when we set this one into motion, just got shorter, shorter fronted, not quite as extended and flexible through that shoulder. As well, when we studied this one in the rear angles of his skeleton, and just got a notch straighter in how he handled his hawk.
Okay, our next class is White Breed Influence Market Lamb. And this is entry 383.
This entry is one that we really like a ton of things about. It seems to be when, the picture that hits me first is the couple of rear view pictures there, really stout featured, really wide topped and big out through that hip and lower leg. And then when we start to study her from the side, we really appreciate the length and levelness down that top line. And then that front view is one that we really appreciate, that wide chest and powerful forearm look. If we get critical on this one, we'd just like to soften her up in her flank just ever so slightly. As we saw in the pictures, a really wide made, big topped ewe lamb that has some stoutness of features to her. If we were to get critical on this one, we would just like to give her a little more or a little less set to that hawk. She wants to get a little more excessive in the set to her hawk, but one that we like quite a bit.
This is entry 408.
We've got a wether here that definitely has some intriguing pieces to them, especially, one of the things that first hits you is how stout featured this one is at the ground. This one, you start to look at the rear view of this one, and you see a ton of shape and a big hip in this one. He appears to be pretty round in his rib cage. If we were to change this one when we start to study this one from the side, we'd just like to give him a little more laid back in his shoulder set. Just give him a notch more lower leg shape when we view that side picture, but one that appears to have a ton of top side dimension and really neat at the ground in terms of his features. And we set this one into motion. The lower angles lower joints in terms of his pastern and hock set appear to be in the right angle set, the right set, and comfortability for this lamb. Again, we just talked about maybe part of the reason that fought the exhibitor a little bit, or maybe not the most cooperative, is just that shoulder set, just maybe not quite as comfortable for that lamb. But we do appreciate the mass that we saw on the top side of this one skeleton, and the look from the side and the stoutness of features. Now, as we compare these two, for me, the class winner will be entry 383 with a blue ribbon. Just that overall mass and dimension working through this one is hard to pass up, and I think she still puts it in a neat package and a good skeleton that's stays comfortable in her top line. As we mentioned. We would just like to soften her in that flank and make her a little more correct in that set to that hock. And I think that's where entry 408, who's going to be second as well, a blue ribbon. Both these as blue ribbons, has some class advantages in terms of being more correct in the set to his hock and in the set to his pastern. He's one that does have some topside shape to him, but when we start to evaluate him in terms of his skeleton, we just like to make him more flexible and extend it up through that front 1/3, and then just from a dimension standpoint, give him a notch more shape to that lower leg.
All right, our next class is individual market lamb. This is entry 389.
This lamb is smooth built, has some power down his top, one that appreciate the stoutness of features. Just first impression in the rear view, we just like to see a little bit more depth of twist and shape through that lower leg, but a nice built, big topped lamb. There we go. As we study this one in motion, we'd just like to make this one just a little bit taller at the point of his shoulder, but as we saw from the pictures, we really like the build and the flexibility and the correctness of the angles of this one. Maybe just a notch taller shouldered.
This is entry 390.
Got a lamb here that really, that kind of excites you when you see that side view in terms of the build and the way this one wedges forward. You see that roundness of that rib cage, and runs the right direction in terms of being uphill and wedge shaped and being tall fronted. You know, when we start to study this one's rear view and 3/4 view, we would like to see just a little bit more terminal muscle shape working through this one, but the build from the side we like a ton. Yeah, again, as we set this one into motion, I think you know, the build from the side is that we saw in the photo really represents this one well, and when we set this one into motion, handles himself good on his feet and legs, and one that you know, we can start to see it in the video here, just maybe not quite as um, uh, powerful right behind that shoulder. We'd like to see just a little bit more muscle shape right there, and as well as we view this one from behind.
Okay, this is entry 409.
Yeah, this ewe lamb here is definitely has some unique pieces to her. She's stout featured. She's extremely expressive in her muscle shape. You can see that working down her top and out through that lower, out through her hip and lower leg. She's one that we really appreciate her length and extension from the side. We'd just like to maybe relax her in her top line a little bit. Yeah, as we you know, study this one in motion, her feet and legs are good and square underneath of her. You know, we still see that muscle working through this one, and you know, if we were you know, kind of similar to what we saw in the picture, just maybe not quite as smooth in that top line. Just like to relax her in the center point of her spine, and maybe blend her just a little bit smoother from that hip and loin transition.
This is entry 544.
So this weather here is one that when we look at the rear view is impressive from behind, has some width to that hip and shape through that lower leg, has some stoutness at the ground. Um, uh, he's one that is long from flank to flank, and appreciate those things about him. We'd just like to maybe make him make his neck attachment just higher at the top side of his shoulder, and maybe just so if we can square him up in that top line a little bit better. Yeah, it's kind of, reiterate what we saw on the pictures there. Long and extended lamb that has some power from behind and stoutness of features. Just one though that maybe a little more relaxed in his spine than we'd prefer, and maybe not quite as tall or not quite as high in his neck attachment out of his shoulder. One that, as we start to study the center portion of his skeleton, would like to see that one a little bit wider in his rib cage and wider over his top as well.
Okay, this is entry 611.
This one here, when we study this one's profile picture, the far left picture, we like quite a bit. That one has a neat look about him. He's long and level down that top line. He's one that has some shape working through that lower leg. And when we study the lower angles of his skeleton, he puts his feet and legs down in the right place. For me, when we study the rear view, we really appreciate the hip and butt shape in this one. We don't have the greatest top view of this one, but if we were to kind of look at that second picture from the left, we'd like to see a little bit more shape on the top side of that lamb, particularly right behind the shoulder. But one that gives us a lot of intriguing pieces. It's a little quicker video there, but as we saw in the side view, appears to handle himself well on the move in terms of his feet and legs and the angles of his lower skeleton. We talked about just like to see a little bit more shape right behind that shoulder, and maybe as we saw in this video here, maybe a notch smoother in that shoulder, maybe gets a little bit more out and pointed in that shoulder shape.
This is entry 911.
This weather here has a ton of growth and extension. Appears to be the of the ones we've seen in this particular division, the longest from flank to flank. Really appreciate that about him. He's one that still, when you study him on the top side of his skeleton, appears to have some shape and expressiveness to him. He's one though that just overall we just like to make him wider skeleton and more dimensional. But we appreciate the length and extension this one has and the look from the side. Yeah, this one handles himself well on his feet and legs, and really, again, the growth and extension this one has. If we study this one on the move, we'd just like to maybe make him cleaner through that front 1/3, maybe just a notch shorter in his neck and a little bit longer in his shoulder blade.
This is entry 918.
This weather here, when we look at that rear view, appears to be big hipped, one that blends smooth from the side, uh, has some stoutness of features, one that appears to be still young and fairly immature yet, maybe not quite as far along in his compositional correctness, but one that has some balance and eye appeal to him. Yeah, again, similar to what we saw in the pictures, one that handles himself well on his feet and legs, is blends smooth and has some shape out through that hip. When we get critical on this one, um, we just like to push him a little bit farther along in terms of his compositional correctness. We just like to freshen him up over that loin, maybe just a notch rigid in that hip loin juncture, but one that in terms of smoothness and balance and eye appeal has a ton of it.
All right, so these are the 4 entries from this class. This one, no. It looks like there was only 4 videos there at the end, but 6 entries in the class. Let me see if we're missing something here. Oh, but it was skipping this one. Here are the second set of entries from this class. Okay, and here are all 7 entries.
All right. A really solid class, tough class to evaluate here. For me, the entry 611 is going to be your first place blue ribbon lamb within this class. I think just the look from the side this one presents for us, and that shape down is you know, top and width out through that hip and lower leg is one that we appreciate quite a bit. If I remember right, we didn't have the greatest um, rear view of this one, but when we studied this one in the video, we really appreciated the width and dimension this one had, and still holding himself to get together well enough in his skeleton. Um, I think the other side view profile maybe made us question how much shape right behind that shoulder this one had. But I think, when we start to weigh the pluses and look for the animals that are the least fault free, I think this one hits us pretty hard and does so to take the class. For me, the next entry would be 389 blue ribbon. That weather there, we talked about the length and extension and the build, and on this one's feet and legs, really appreciated those things about him. He's probably not quite as far along in terms of his muscle development and not quite as powerful today, but I think this one's build and has the right parts and pieces to be second in class. For me, the third in class will be entry 409 as well, a blue ribbon. That ewe lamb we talked about, how shapely that one was, how expressive that one was, and we definitely think she's ideal in terms of her compositional correctness. Just some things that concerned us when we set her into motion, just maybe not quite as relaxed in that spine, not quite as smooth in that hip loin juncture, but still one that's shapely and still good built. Then for me, it would go to entry 390 as well, blue ribbon. This lamb from the side, we appreciate the length and extension and tall shouldered. This one is he's one that we really appreciate when we set him into motion, handles himself well on his feet and legs. He had some shape out through that hip and lower leg. Again, this one we'd just like to make a little bit more powerful right behind that shoulder and over that loin, but one that builds a good picture for us, and I think still has enough shape to slide into that fourth spot. Then for me, we'll go with entry 544 as red ribbon. That weather there is one that we talked about being wide based and really neat in that rib cage and having some length, from the side. That one is stout at the ground. Although we would like to change this one in terms of that shoulder and neck, and just making that one just a little bit stronger in his top line, but one that we appreciate the rib shape and overall skeletal width of that one. Then from there, we'll go to, there we go, 918, a red ribbon as well. We just talked about how this one's just slightly, just not quite there yet, just not quite as powerful over his top and from behind, maybe kind of the pounds light one within this class break. stout featured, good built from the side, just not quite as far along in his muscle. And, we'd just like to make him a notch better right through that front 1/3 as well. And then to round out the class entry 911 red ribbon as well. Again, we talked about how long and extended this one is. But when we started to study this one in terms of his muscle, just kind of a little bit flatter, not as dimensional, not as as pulled apart in his overall skeleton, just needs some more time on feed.
Okay, so that was the end of the first class break. So these next entries are for the same class. This is entry 922.
This lamb here is one that is long and extended from the side. He's stout featured. He's one that runs uphill. When we look at his top view, has some shape over that rack and out through that hip. As we get critical on this one, we'd just like to see a little bit more shape through that lower leg. This one handles himself well on the move. As we mentioned, we just like to see a little more shape through that lower leg. And as we see in this video here, maybe just a little rounder in that rib to transition a little bit smoother into that shoulder.
This is entry 1071.
Yeah, this lamb here is one that's extremely big hipped and has a ton of circumference, a lower leg. This one is long and level down that top line. If we were to change this one, we'd just like to make them a little bit rounder ribbed and a little stouter featured. Again, this one's really wide made and robust in his features in terms of his rib cage and top and hip and butt. Just on the move here, we'd just like to make him just a little bit squarer out of his dock and a little bit more flexible in that rear set to his leg.
This is entry 1094.
This one draws a really good picture from the side. That neck comes really high out of the top side of this one's shoulder, long and level down that top line. Has some shape through that lower leg. One that when we look at the rear view, seems to be pulled apart in a skeleton. For me, where we'd get critical on this one is we'd just like to shallow him up in his chest a little bit and make that rib cage just a notch rounder. And as we expected, based on this one's side profile, handles himself well on the move, stays collected in his skeleton and top line. Um, just as we talked about, the main area we would prefer to change him is just to shallow him up in that chest floor ever so slightly to give him a notch rounder rib.
Next entry is entry 1095.
This one here is one that we really appreciate the the butt shape this one has a ton of shape working through that lower leg. One that is round ribbed and has some robustness to him. He appears to be wide topped. We've got a little bit of a glare on that picture there, but it appears to be wide topped. This one though, we'd just like to give him some more extension from the side, from flank to flank and up through that front 1/3. This one handles himself well on the move. If we were to get critical on this one, we'd just like to see a little bit more base width and skeletal width underneath.
This is entry 1131.
Yeah, I really like quite a bit about this lamb. Just the build from the side, the rear view. Starting at the ground, this one's stout featured. Looks to be correct in the angles of his skeleton. He's super angular in terms of the way he's designed. Has the right look about him in terms of running uphill and being wedge shaped. And then you look at the pictures from the rear view, and he has a ton of width and dimension and power over his top and out through his hip and lower leg, and still being an attractive package. Yeah, this one here, like we talked about, a really attractive package, one that has a lot of width and dimension um, on the top side of a skeleton. You know, as we set this one into motion, if we're to get critical, um, just narrows up ever so slightly at the ground, but that's getting awfully picky and but one that has really good balance and good on his feet and legs and still really powerful.
This is entry 1215.
This weather here's really powerfully built, one that is wide skeleton, wide based, one that has a lot of shape out through his lower leg. Um, for me, if I were to get critical on this one, I'd just like to, um, just make this lamb taller shouldered, a little smoother in that shoulder, and as well maybe trim him up. I know it's hard to tell in a picture, but just like to trim him up in his composition. Maybe he'd have a little more shape and expression to his muscle. Yeah, as we study that one on the move, I think again, we'd just like to make them a notch taller shouldered and give them a little more um, uh, authority out of that hip. Wants to duck his pins just ever so slightly. But as we talked about in the pictures, I mean, that one is really wide made and powerful, and has a ton of good to them.
This is the first three from the class. All right, and here are the second three from this class. And then here are all 6 entries from this class.
Yeah, a really competitive class here. For me, still, I think we can see some differences within these animals and kind of align them. For me, the 1131 entry will be your class winner, blue ribbon. That one just hit me really hard in terms of the build and then the rear view, the shape down his top and out through that lower leg, and one that is really built good from the side, athletic in his movement, and still stays collected in his skeleton when he takes the lead. As we got critical on him when we set him into motion, he does narrow at the ground just a slightly, but that's getting awfully critical. For me, the next lamb in class would be that 1215. Would be also a blue ribbon lamb. He maybe has that advantage of maintaining his width to the ground. He too is another powerful lamb, but as we talked about when we saw his individual picture and video, he's got a ton of power and width and dimension, and still balances up nice from the side. We just like to see him more expressive in his muscle shape, and when we put him in motion, we just like to make him taller shouldered and a little squarer out of that hip. Then for me, it would go to 1071, another blue ribbon lamb. He's one that we were really impressed with. This one's rear view in terms of hip and butt shape, one that is really wide made. For us, though, as we start to evaluate this one, he's one that isn't quite as smooth in his overall build. Maybe gets a little piecier in his transitions, but one in terms of muscle and dimension has a ton of it. Then for me, again, a tough class here. I'm going to go with the 1094 weather. For another blue ribbon, we talked about this one from the side. We really appreciated how high that one's neck ties into the top side of his shoulder. He's one that's extremely level down that top line and has some shape through that lower leg, and appears to be really massive over his top. For us, though, when we look at that lamb in comparison to the ones above him, he was just not quite as round in that rib cage, not quite as shallow in his chest, maybe a little bit plainer look about him. Then for me, entry 922 with a red ribbon there, one that we really appreciated the build from the side. This one's stoutness at the ground, the length and extension this one has. We just need to add some more muscle and feed on this one. I think he's got the right parts and pieces, just not quite far along enough today, just not quite as dimensional as the ones we placed above him. And then 1095 red ribbon, that one there, as we talked about, has some shape through that lower leg, has some shape down his top. He handles himself well on the move, but when we did study that lamb in motion, he didn't quite maintain his width at the ground, tended to hawk in a little bit from behind and a little bit narrower through that chest. And we just like to extend him from the side as well, but one that has the shape and robustness and rugged build. We just need to make him wider all the way through.
We would like to thank our judge, our 4-H and FFA exhibitors, their families, our volunteers, our staff, and our 2020 4-H Fair recognition and trophy donors. Thank you for watching.